Ever wish you could, like, sit down with one of those legendary military minds from the past? Grab a coffee, pick their brain.
Right, like a master class with Sun Tzu or something.
Exactly. Well, today we're doing the next best thing. We're diving into the work of Carl von Clausewitz.
Ah, Clausewitz. A giant in military theory. He actually studied Napoleon.
He did. And his book On War is still studied in military academies today.
For good reason. So, what part are we tackling in this deep dive?
Chapter 6, Destruction of the Enemy's Armies.
Hmm.
It's a pretty intense title, right? But it gets right to the heart of military objectives.
And this isn't just about winning battles on a map. Clausewitz is thinking bigger picture here, right?
Absolutely. He's talking about completely dismantling your enemy's ability to wage war. So for our listener out there wearing the uniform, this is about understanding the strategic endgame.
And what's fascinating is that Clausewitz doesn't limit himself to just, those big decisive battles.
Oh, interesting. So what else does he see as essential for, as he puts it, destroying the enemy's armies?
He argues that even taking a fortress or a strategically vital piece of land can be just as effective in crippling your opponent.
So it's not always about direct confrontation. It's more about the bigger picture, crippling their ability to function as a military force.
Exactly. Think about it in a modern context, securing those vital supply lines.
Right, like cutting off access to fuel, ammunition.
Exactly. Without those, an army, no matter how big or well-equipped,
They're toast.
they're effectively neutralized.
That makes perfect sense, especially in today's world where logistics are absolutely crucial. It's like grounding a modern air force by cutting off their fuel or spare parts.
Right. And this was something Clausewitz was already analyzing back in the 19th century. But here's the thing. He also offers a word of caution.
Oh, what's that?
Clausewitz says, don't overestimate the impact of these bloodless victories.
Bloodless victories.
Yep.
So things like disrupting supply lines, capturing strategic locations.
Right. He's saying those things can definitely weaken an enemy, but
They're not the knockout punch.
Right. Exactly. You're unlikely to force a complete surrender that way.
Because even with limited resources, a determined enemy can still be a formidable opponent.
Absolutely. And that leads us to Chapter 7, where Clausewitz shifts gears a bit. He starts dissecting the complexities of the offensive battle.
Okay, so moving from weakening the enemy from afar to taking the fight directly to them. What does Clausewitz see as the key to a successful offensive?
Speed and maneuver. He was a huge proponent of outmaneuvering the enemy.
So we're talking about flanking maneuvers, encirclements, that sort of thing.
Precisely. Think about Napoleon's tactics at the Battle of Austerlitz.
Oh, that was a masterclass in maneuver warfare.
Exactly. Napoleon used feints and carefully planned movements to lure the Austro-Russian army right into a trap.
And they ended up encircled, crushed by a smaller force.
Precisely. And these principles, the flanking, the encirclements...
They're still relevant in modern warfare.
Absolutely.
Right.
Think about air superiority, which is so crucial these days. Achieving that often involves flanking maneuvers, utilizing stealth technology, electronic warfare.
To disrupt radar communications.
Yes.
It's like a high-stakes chess game, but instead of knights and bishops, you've got fighter jets and cyber warfare units.
Right. But, and this is classic Clausewitz, he cautions against getting caught up in the idea of reckless haste.
Okay, so speed is important, but
it has to be a controlled advance. You don't want to rush in blindly and risk unnecessary casualties or strategic blunders.
right, you need to balance that swift defense with calculated movement.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you run the risk of stumbling into, say, unfamiliar territory without proper reconnaissance, walking right into an ambush.
Exactly. And that takes us back to an idea we touched on earlier, the fog of war.
Ah, yes. Something Clausewitz was very aware of, even back then.
Absolutely. He knew that even the most prepared military leader can never have a complete picture of the battlefield.
Right. There are always unknowns, always factors you can't predict.
Exactly. And that uncertainty,
It's a constant.
it influences every decision you make.
So how do you make sound judgments when you're constantly dealing with incomplete information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Clausewitz grapples with extensively.
So before we went off on that tangent, we were talking about that fog of war that Clausewitz talks about. How does he think you should deal with that, especially when you've got to make big decisions with only part of the picture?
Well, Clausewitz says you can't totally get rid of the fog of war, but you can try to lessen its effects.
Okay. Yeah.
Careful planning, thorough reconnaissance, and being ready to adapt, when things inevitably change.
So you're saying, like, be prepared but be flexible. Because in war, Things rarely go exactly according to plan, right?
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he highlights this thing he calls the coup d'oeil. It's French, means like
Stroke of the eye. Glance. Right.
Right, right. And it refers to basically a commander's ability to look at a really complex situation on the battlefield and just like,
Make a judgment call.
yes, even with limited information.
Man, that sounds incredibly tough to do. Like making split-second decisions with like huge consequences.
It is. It's not just thinking quickly, though. It's about intuition. Intuition you develop through experience, through studying, through really understanding those military principles.
Is that coup d'oeil? Is that something you can like train for? Or are some military leaders just like born with it?
I think it's a little of both. Some people might naturally have a better feel for tactics, but Clausewitz thought you could definitely develop that coup d'oeil with the right kind of training.
Makes sense. So like any skill, really, the more you practice, the sharper your instincts get, especially under pressure.
Right. And this leads into another really interesting part of Clausewitz's work, his focus on the psychological side of warfare.
Okay, the mental game. How does that factor in?
Well, he says that the defender, right, they're often coming into the fight already at a disadvantage mentally.
Because they're, what, on edge? Waiting for the attack?
Exactly. That constant worry, that anticipation.
You can use that against them.
Clausewitz thought so. A smart attacker, he can use that to create chaos and confusion in the enemy's ranks before the first shot is even fired.
So we're talking about psychological warfare.
Oh, absolutely. And Clausewitz understood how powerful that mental battle is for achieving victory. He talks about different attack tactics, and one that really stands out is the oblique attack.
Okay, remind me, what is that one again?
So instead of attacking the enemy head-on, you focus your forces on a weaker spot in their line.
Right, right. Hit them where they're vulnerable.
Yes. It's about choosing your battles, concentrating your forces to punch through at that weak point and create chaos. It's often much more effective than trying to encircle a whole enemy force.
Right, that could be really tough to pull off.
It can. But if you think about it in a modern context, this oblique attack, it's still totally relevant. Think about a small team of, like, special forces infiltrating an enemy base, taking out a key target.
Right, right. They're not launching a full-on assault, but they're disrupting the enemy's plans.
Exactly. And it just goes to show Clausewitz's ideas, they still resonate even though warfare looks very different now.
Totally. So we've talked about this idea of concentrating your forces, especially in that fog of war. Why is that concentration so important for Clausewitz?
Because when you're not sure where the enemy is, what they're planning,
Right, that fog.
keeping your forces concentrated, it reduces your vulnerability.
Makes sense. You can react faster, hit harder if you need to.
Exactly. You become a much more difficult target to take down.
It's like they say, don't bring a knife to a gunfight.
Right. You want to be the one with that concentrated power.
Makes sense. So what happens if you don't do that, if you divide your forces too much?
Clausewitz says that's a recipe for disaster. You might win a few small battles, but you could very well lose the war.
Which is like the opposite of what you want.
Exactly. Especially nowadays when conflicts, they can be so unpredictable. Look at like guerrilla warfare, for example.
Right.
Knowing where your troops are, having good communication, understanding the environment, it's all crucial.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you risk being caught off guard, isolated, and picked apart.
It's like you got to be taking those Clausewitz principles and like adapting them, right, for however warfare is evolving.
Exactly. And speaking of adapting, Clausewitz, he puts a lot of emphasis on the pursuit.
Pursuit, you mean after you've already like won a battle?
Exactly. He says that's when you really capitalize on a victory. You got to keep the pressure on, demoralize the enemy, maybe even end the conflict faster because they can't regroup.
Okay, so you're turning a tactical win into a strategic one.
Right. He uses the example of Napoleon after the Battle of Jena. Napoleon just relentlessly pursued the Prussians, and it led to their complete collapse.
Wow. But isn't there also a danger in that? Like, if you're chasing a retreating enemy, your own forces.
Oh, you're right to point that out. Clausewitz, he says, a reckless pursuit, that can be just as bad as being too hesitant to attack. You've got to be careful that you aren't spreading your forces too thin or walking into some kind of trap. Right, right. There's a balance, like always. Knowing when to press your advantage and when to hold back.
Exactly. And of course, all of this is happening within that fog of war we were talking about.
Right. Never forget the fog.
Clausewitz wants us to remember that uncertainty, it's just something you have to deal with in warfare. Military leaders have to get used to making decisions without having all the facts.
Which sounds, honestly, kind of terrifying.
It is a heavy burden, for sure.
So how do you even prepare for that, to be making those tough calls when you don't expect it is like guaranteed. What does Clausewitz say?
He says you've got to be adaptable. Plan meticulously, yes, but also be ready to toss that plan aside if the situation calls for it.
So, like, be prepared to improvise.
Exactly. It's about staying flexible, rolling with the punches, because the battlefield, it rarely plays out the way you imagine it.
So we've talked about how important it is to be adaptable, especially with all that uncertainty Clausewitz talks about. But how do you square that with the need to plan things out carefully? Seems like one of those, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail situations,
Okay,
right?
you need a plan, definitely. But Clausewitz, he's all about striking that balance. He says, a good plan, it's essential, but
But
it's not sacred. You can't be afraid to deviate from it when things inevitably go sideways, which they always do in war.
it's like having a roadmap, but you're ready to take a detour, maybe even blaze a new trail if you hit a roadblock or see a better way forward.
Exactly. Clausewitz actually uses a really cool analogy to explain this. He says navigating the chaos of war, it's like trying to walk through a dense forest.
Okay, I kind of see where you're going with this.
You've got a general sense of direction, right? But you have to be constantly adjusting your path. Thick undergrowth here, rough terrain there.
Obstacles you couldn't have predicted?
Precisely. So you adapt. You adjust. It's not about stubbornly sticking to the original plan when the situation on the ground demands something different.
That makes a lot of sense. And that actually brings to mind another thing Clausewitz talks about, this idea of friction in warfare. What exactly did he mean by that?
He's talking about all those little things that can derail even the best laid plans, unexpected delays, miscommunication. Stuff happens. It's the difference between those perfect maneuvers you draw up on a map versus the messy reality of combat.
So it's like the fog of war, but instead of just missing information, it's more about those unpredictable human elements, mistakes, misjudgments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Clausewitz, as a good military leader, they've got to be able to anticipate that friction as much as possible, try to minimize it, but also realize you can never truly eliminate it.
Sounds like it takes a certain kind of person to thrive in that kind of environment. Someone who can think on their feet, stay calm under pressure.
Absolutely. Clausewitz, he really believed that being adaptable, making those crucial decisions, even when things are uncertain and chaotic.
That's what separates the great military leaders from the rest.
Exactly. And one of the things I find most fascinating about Clausewitz is that he recognizes that warfare is not just about tactics or having the best technology. It's about so much more. Strategy, psychology, luck, willpower. He saw it as this complex web of factors all pushing and pulling.
And at the center of it all are human beings.
Yeah.
Making decisions, dealing with fear, exhaustion, the fog of war.
Exactly. And while we've been talking a lot about offensive warfare, Clausewitz, he stresses that understanding all of this, it's just as important for defense.
Which makes sense. If you're going to counter an enemy's move, you got to be able to anticipate it. You got to try to get inside their heads.
Exactly. And that's why Clausewitz, his writing, it still resonates with us today. The specific weapons and tactics, those might change, but those core principles, the importance of adapting, understanding the psychology of conflict, those are timeless.
Absolutely. So for our listener out there, someone who's chosen to dedicate their life to serving in the military,
Putting themselves in harm's way.
what would you say is the most important takeaway from our deep dive into Clausewitz?
I think the biggest lesson is that learning never stops. You have to always be adapting. The world's not static, and warfare is constantly evolving right along with it.
It's not enough to master the tools of today. You have to be thinking ahead, challenging your assumptions.
Exactly. You need that intellectual flexibility to anticipate what's coming next. So yeah, be a student of history, of strategy, learn about human psychology, because all of those things are going to help you navigate the complexities of conflict, no matter what form it takes.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Carl von Clausewitz and his thoughts on destruction of the enemy's armies.
It's been a fascinating journey into the mind of a true giant of military theory.
Absolutely. To our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.